The sheriffs laughed at the ragged stranger and thought he was weak. But 1 minute changed everything. Look how one unarmed man silenced the whole town. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The sun had already begun its slow descent when the town of Dry Creek seemed to pause in the heat of the late afternoon. The wooden facades of the buildings glowed faintly in the orange haze, dust hanging lazily above the main street like smoke from an invisible fire. The saloon was the loudest place, its piano rattling unevenly as someone hammered out a half-forgotten tune, while men shouted over their cards and mugs clinked against scarred tables. The rest of the street was quieter. A woman hurried a child inside before the air turned cooler with the falling evening, and an old man sat outside the general store chewing tobacco, spitting into the dirt with mechanical precision. The center of all attention, however, was the broad porch of the saloon, where Sheriff Maddox and his two deputies sat like kings upon their thrones. Maddox was a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache that curled like a sneer, even when he wasn't smiling. His star-shaped badge glimmered in the fading sunlight, pinned firmly to his vest as though it were not merely a symbol of authority, but of ownership over every soul in town. His deputies, young men barely out of their 20s, echoed his mannerisms with clumsy bravado. They laughed too loudly, leaned too far back in their chairs, and drank too quickly from their glasses, eager to show the town that they belonged beside the sheriff. Each gesture was designed to remind the people that the law here was not in the written codes, but in Maddox's gaze. No one crossed him, not unless they were ready to be made into an example. Most folks in Dry Creek had grown used to that rhythm. Better to lower your eyes than to raise your voice. Better to nod at Maddox's cruel jokes than to find yourself in a cell overnight or worse. The sheriff maintained order, yes, but it was an order carved out of fear. Everyone felt it, though no one spoke of it aloud. Even now, as Maddox leaned back in his chair and pointed out a passing drifter with a crude remark, the laughter that rose from his deputies was echoed by a few townsfolk standing nearby. The laughter was hollow, forced, the sound of people who had forgotten what real humor sounded like. Then came the sound of hoofbeats, faint at first, growing steadily louder. The old man outside the store raised his eyes from the ground, and the piano inside the saloon stumbled to a halt as curious heads turned. From the western road, where the dust of the desert met the first boards of the town's main street, a lone rider appeared. His horse was gaunt, ribs showing faintly beneath its hide, each step heavy as though it had carried its master across miles without rest. The rider himself looked scarcely better. His hat was stained and battered, the brim bent out of shape. His coat hung loose and dusty on his frame, the edges frayed by long travel and hard weather. Boots scuffed and worn, spurs dulled to near uselessness. There was no shine to him, no gleam of gold or polish of steel. Just a man who had seen more miles of desert than a body should. The rider slowed as he reached the edge of the saloon, dismounted with deliberate care, and tied his horse to the hitching post. For a moment, the town seemed to study him as though he were a puzzle dropped into their midst. He didn't carry the swagger of a gunslinger or the stiff bearing of a soldier. He looked instead like a man who had spent too long under the sun and learned patience from the horizon itself. Sheriff Maddox eyed him with thinly veiled disdain. "Well, what have we here?" His voice cut through the air like a whip. "Another wanderer blown in from the desert? You lose your way, friend, or just too stubborn to die out there?" The deputies snickered. One of them leaned forward and spat into the dirt, just inches from the newcomer's boots. "Look at him, Sheriff. Poor soul's got a horse half dead, clothes hanging like rags. Bet he ain't had a decent meal in weeks. Maybe he came crawling for a handout." The man didn't flinch. He lifted his head slightly, revealing a face lined by sun and dust, eyes steady and calm beneath the shadow of his hat. He spoke simply, without challenge, his voice low but carrying across the porch. "I'm looking for water for the horse, a place to rest my own feet. Nothing more." The words, plain as they were, only made Maddox's lip curl further. "Water, is it? This town's got rules, stranger. We don't just hand over kindness to the first ragged drifter who wanders in. You want something here, you earn it. And by the looks of you, you ain't got much to offer." A few chuckles rippled from the gathered onlookers, Though most people avoided meeting the stranger's gaze, there was something unsettling in his composure, in the way he didn't rise to Maddox's bait. Maddox himself felt it, though he hid it behind louder laughter. He wanted a reaction, wanted this stranger to play the role of the fool, the weak man, the butt of the joke. Instead, he got silence and a nod, as though the man were listening to something beyond the sheriff's words. One of the deputies, eager to show off, stepped down from the porch and squared up in front of the stranger. "Didn't you hear the sheriff? You're standing in Dry Creek now. Around here, you don't just wander in and act like you belong. You got to prove yourself." With that, he gave the man a shove to the shoulder, hard enough to make him stagger a step back. The stranger steadied himself without so much as a flicker of anger. He reached down, adjusted the strap of his saddlebag, and looked the deputy in the eyes. "I came for water, not trouble," he said, voice steady as stone. The deputy laughed too loudly. "Hear that? Says he don't want trouble. Maybe trouble don't want him either." The other deputy slapped his thigh at the joke, while Maddox leaned forward, studying the stranger more closely now. The people who had gathered along the street shifted uneasily. They had seen men beg, seen men fight, seen men crumble under Maddox's gaze. But this was different. This stranger didn't beg, didn't fight, didn't crumble. He simply stood, dust settling around him, shoulders square, eyes calm as though he had all the time in the world. Maddox rose slowly from his chair, boots thudding heavily on the wooden boards of the porch. He towered over the scene, his presence meant to crush whatever resistance lingered. "You hear me, stranger? You think you can just stroll in, speak soft, and keep your dignity? This town don't care for dignity. Around here, respect comes when I say it does." The man met his eyes at last, unblinking, unafraid. "Respect is not yours to give, Sheriff," he said. "It's in how you carry yourself. Even a man sweeping the street can have it if he knows who he is." The words struck harder than a fist. For a heartbeat, the street fell silent. Even the deputies stopped laughing. Maddox's jaw tightened, the cords in his neck straining as he fought the sudden burn of anger. The crowd waited, breath held, knowing something had shifted in the air. The stranger bent down slowly, scooped a handful of dust into his palm, and let it fall again, drifting in the dying light. Then he stepped forward, past the deputy who had shoved him, and untied his horse with a quiet touch. He walked it toward the trough at the end of the street, every movement measured, steady, a man who would not be broken by mockery. Behind him, Maddox's voice called out again, harsher, louder, but less certain than before. "You think you're too good to play along, stranger? You'll learn soon enough what happens to men who think they're better than the law of this town." The stranger didn't turn. He didn't answer. He led his horse to water, the sound of its grateful lapping the only reply. The townsfolk watched with wide eyes, torn between a fear of the sheriff and a new, unspoken respect for the nameless figure who had just walked into Dry Creek and refused to bow. And though no one yet knew it, that quiet moment marked the beginning of something the town had long forgotten, an end to laughter born of cruelty and the first stirrings of dignity in a place that had long lived without it. The stranger's quiet defiance lingered in the evening air long after he had led his horse to the trough and let it drink. People drifted back into the saloon, though the laughter that rose there had lost its edge. Cards were slapped against the tables, dice rolled, boots tapped on wooden floorboards. Yet the atmosphere felt thinner, like the thread of a storm stretched taut across the sky. Sheriff Maddox sat on the porch with his jaw clenched, staring at the fading silhouette of the man who had walked past him without fear. His deputies whispered to each other, half mocking, half unsettled, unable to reconcile the ragged clothes of the traveler with the calm weight he carried. Pride burned hotter than the whiskey in Maddox's glass. In his mind, the town itself had been challenged, for he was the law, and if the law could be ignored with a nod and a quiet word, then the fragile order of Dry Creek would crumble. By the time the stranger returned from the trough and tied his horse again, the crowd had regathered on the street. Curiosity pulled them like moths to a lantern. They wanted to see what Maddox would do next, whether the sheriff would let such a quiet insult pass, or whether his authority would demand a spectacle. Maddox pushed himself to his feet and stepped down from the porch, spurs clicking against the planks. His deputies flanked him, eager to prove themselves useful, their hands twitching toward the holsters they rarely had cause to use. The sheriff raised his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "You think a nod and a few soft words make you a man? In Dry Creek, you earn respect by showing what you're made of. You say you came for water, but men who live off the mercy of others are no better than beggars. Show us your worth. Lift that barrel by the well. Let the town see if you've got the strength of a man or the weakness of a drifter." Eyes turned to the heavy barrel standing near the well, filled with supplies hauled in from the last wagon train. It took 2 men to move it, sometimes 3, and Maddox's order carried an edge designed to humiliate. The stranger looked at the barrel for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Strength is improved by stunts. I didn't ride across the desert to play games." His voice was calm, but its refusal struck the crowd like a bell. The deputies cackled, pointing. "Hear that? Says he's too good for a little work. Too good for all of us. Must be some kind of king beneath those rags." Their laughter was high-pitched and desperate, for beneath it lay the echo of unease. The crowd chuckled along, but fewer voices joined, and the stranger's steady refusal seemed heavier than the barrel itself. Maddox's pride swelled with anger. He stepped closer, close enough that the smell of whiskey and sweat mixed with the desert dust between them. "You're in my town, stranger. You don't say no to me." With a sharp motion of his hand, he signaled one of his deputies. The young man lunged forward and shoved the stranger hard, sending him stumbling to the dirt. Gasps rippled through the street. The crowd leaned forward as though expecting a fight, waiting for the stranger to leap up in fury. But the man did not rage. He rose slowly, brushing the dust from his sleeve with deliberate care. His hat had fallen, and one of the deputies picked it up with a grin, dropped it in the mud, and ground it beneath his boot. The stranger bent, lifted the hat, and tapped the dirt away. He set it on his head once more, his eyes fixed on Maddox, steady and calm. His voice was quiet, yet carried across the hush. "Your power is in laughter, Sheriff, but laughter won't guard this town. It won't stop the wind or the fire. It won't keep a man alive when the desert takes his water. Respect doesn't come from making others crawl." The words hung heavy, pressing down on the crowd. Even the piano inside the saloon stuttered into silence, the music dying as though the keys themselves had felt the weight. A few townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, their chuckles dying in their throats. For the first time, they found themselves ashamed, not of the stranger's ragged clothes, but of their own echoing laughter. Maddox's face darkened, red seeping into his skin. He could feel the attention of the crowd slipping, the hold he had maintained through fear unraveling by threads. His deputies looked at him for direction, their bravado faltering. The sheriff spat into the dirt, his boots grinding against the ground as he stepped forward. "Enough of your riddles, stranger. If you're too scared to prove yourself with strength, then prove yourself with courage. Stand against me, here and now. Let the town see if you've got a backbone, or if you're just a shadow in the dust." A hush swept the street, heavier than before. Mothers pulled children back from the edge of the crowd. Old men leaned closer on their canes. The tension coiled tight, every breath held, all eyes fixed on the stranger, waiting to see if he would rise to Maddox's challenge. He lifted his gaze, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. His eyes held neither fear nor arrogance, only a steady resolve. "I came here for rest," he said, voice even. "Not to fight, but understand this. A man who needs to prove himself by crushing others has already shown his weakness." The crowd's silence thickened. Even the deputies faltered, their hands falling from their holsters, their laughter choked off by the sharp edge of the words. Maddox clenched his fists, torn between striking the man and stepping back. He could feel the shift in the people, could sense their hearts tilting like scales. He had built his power on intimidation, on the simple fact that no one had dared to say no, and now before everyone, someone had. The stranger's calmness spread like a ripple in water. A boy near the front of the crowd whispered, not to anyone in particular, "He's not afraid." An old woman, leaning on her cane, murmured, "It's been a long time since we saw a man stand so steady." The murmurs grew, low but insistent, the kind that planted seeds. Maddox tried to speak, to bark out an order that would bring the weight of authority back to his voice, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, his deputy stepped forward, eager to restore the moment. He grabbed the stranger's arm and shoved again, harder this time. "You'll fight whether you like it or not," he sneered. What happened next silenced even the harshest breath. The stranger turned his arm in a smooth, effortless motion, not striking, not hurting, but redirecting the deputy's grip until the young man stumbled forward, nearly falling to the ground. The stranger released him at once, steadying him with a light touch, as though helping a child regain balance. Then he stepped back, hands open, voice still calm. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but know this: trouble is not the same as strength, and pride is the enemy of peace." The deputy's face burned with shame as he stumbled back, muttering curses. Maddox's fury surged, but beneath it was a gnawing unease. He could not deny what his eyes had seen. The crowd could not unsee it either. The stranger had moved like a man who knew control, who carried power not in bluster, but in silence. The sun slipped lower, casting long shadows across the street. The crowd waited, trapped between the sheriff's wounded pride and the stranger's quiet authority. The weight of the moment pressed on everyone, heavy as stone. For the first time in years, the people of Dry Creek felt something they had nearly forgotten: hope that perhaps fear was not the only way to live. The stranger stood tall, hat pulled low, eyes calm as the desert horizon. He had refused the games, endured the shoves, and spoken truths that no one dared voice. The crowd knew instinctively that the trial was not over, that pride once wounded would demand more. But they also knew something else. The man in rags, the wanderer who asked only for water, had already shaken the foundations of Dry Creek more than any outlaw's bullet ever had. And as the last light of day bled across the sky, the town felt itself teetering on the edge of a change it had not asked for, but could no longer avoid. The silence that hung over Dry Creek at the close of that long evening did not lift with the dawn. When morning came, the townsfolk spoke in hushed tones, replaying the images of the night before. The ragged stranger standing calmly in the dust, refusing to be baited, moving with a quiet grace that unbalanced the deputy without raising a hand in anger. It was the kind of moment that burrowed into people's minds and stayed there, stronger than any gunshot or brawl. For Maddox, however, it was a wound to his pride, one that festered through the night until it became unbearable. He had ruled this town not through kindness, not through wisdom, but through fear, and fear required constant reinforcement. The stranger's refusal to play the role of the fool was more than an insult. It was a crack in the wall Maddox had built around himself, a crack the whole town had seen. He knew that if he allowed the man to walk away untested, his grip on Dry Creek would loosen like sand in a desert wind. By mid-morning, the saloon was filled with restless energy. The sheriff's deputies strutted more than usual, though their eyes betrayed nerves they could not hide. They spoke loudly of how the stranger had refused to show his worth, how he had insulted the town by walking past the law as if it were nothing more than another shadow in the street. They exaggerated, twisted details, tried to turn the murmurs of doubt into sparks of anger, but the townsfolk only listened quietly, nodding without conviction. The stranger had unsettled them, yes, but he had also stirred something else, a recognition that perhaps strength did not lie in Maddox's badge or his deputy's mockery. By noon, the sheriff himself strode through the town, his spurs clanging against the boards, his face set like stone. He stopped at the general store, spoke loudly to the owner about how discipline needed to be shown. He stopped at the blacksmith, told him that disrespect to the badge was disrespect to everyone. His words carried the weight of command, but not the fire of belief. Each time he spoke, eyes slid away from him. Glances lingered not on the sheriff, but on the memory of the stranger who had faced him without fear. Maddox knew he had no choice left. His pride demanded resolution. That evening, when the sun dipped low again and the sky filled with the red glow of another desert sunset, Maddox called out to the stranger before the gathered crowd. The main street was filled now, lined with townsfolk drawn from their homes and shops, children perched on fence rails, women holding one another's hands, men trying to mask their unease with folded arms. Maddox's voice rang through the air, sharp and commanding. You stand here in Dry Creek, stranger, and you think you can ignore the law. You think you can turn your back on a challenge and walk free. Well, I say no man walks away from me without proving himself. If you're a man, you'll stand against me. Here, now, on this street. Let's see if there's steel in your backbone or only dust. The words rippled through the crowd like thunder, and a murmur rose in reply. Some shook their heads, others whispered, but all eyes turned toward the stranger. He stood at the far end of the street near the well, his horse tied behind him, his shoulders squared. He took one slow step forward, then another, walking into the dying light. He did not rush, did not posture. The hush that fell over the town was broken only by the creak of boards and the faint clatter of a shutter in the wind. When he stopped in the middle of the street opposite Maddox, the air seemed to grow heavy. The deputies stood behind their sheriff, grinning nervously, but their hands shook near their belts. Maddox's own hand hovered near his revolver, fingers twitching as though eager for the draw. The crowd held its breath. Everyone knew what this looked like. The classic duel at sunset, the kind of moment ballads were sung about and legends born from. But there was something different here. The stranger had no weapon in his hand. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, his face calm, eyes steady. Maddox sneered. You don't even have the courage to draw? You mock this town by standing empty-handed? The stranger's voice came low, clear, and steady. I came for rest, not blood, but you keep asking for proof. You think proof lies in killing, in putting fear into others. It doesn't. A man proves himself by what he chooses not to do. The sheriff barked a laugh, though the edge in his voice was brittle. Fine words from a drifter, but words won't save you now. He shifted his stance, hand brushing the grip of his revolver. In that instant, time seemed to bend. The stranger's body moved, not with the frantic twitch of a gunslinger, but with the smooth inevitability of a river flowing downhill. As Maddox's hand touched the revolver, the stranger stepped forward, turned his shoulder, and with a single motion disarmed him. The revolver spun in the air and landed in the dirt between them with a dull thud. The crowd gasped. Maddox stood frozen, his hand still outstretched, fingers grasping nothing but air. The stranger had not struck him, had not harmed him, had simply taken the weapon from him as easily as one might pluck a stone from the ground. The sheriff's face flushed crimson, his authority unraveling with each heartbeat. The stranger bent, lifted the revolver, and then, to the astonishment of all, placed it gently back in the dirt at Maddox's feet. He stepped back, giving ground, his voice carrying across the street. I don't want your weapon. I don't want your power. I want you to understand. Strength isn't in a badge or a gun. It's in knowing when not to use them. The words sliced deeper than any blade. Maddox opened his mouth, but no sound came. His deputies shifted uneasily, their bravado drained away. The crowd murmured, awe mixing with disbelief. They had seen violence before, quick draws and bloody endings, but they had never seen this. A man who controlled the moment without spilling a drop of blood. Maddox, trembling with rage and shame, lunged forward as though to shove the stranger, but once again the man moved with the same effortless control. He caught the sheriff's arm, turned it gently, and guided him past without harm, leaving Maddox stumbling in the dust. Then he released him, stepping back with the calm of a man who had nothing left to prove. The crowd erupted, not with cheers, but with gasps and a heavy silence that followed. The stranger stood tall, his words ringing again through the air. You wear a badge, Sheriff, but it doesn't give you the right to mock others. Discipline means knowing when to stop. You should think about what that means. For a long moment, no one moved. Maddox stared at the dirt, his pride broken, his voice lost. The deputies looked to him for guidance, but found none. The people of Dry Creek felt something they had not felt in years, a sudden surge of hope, the knowledge that authority could be challenged not with bullets, but with dignity. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the street in shadows. The stranger stepped back, his hat low, his frame steady, and the town knew it had witnessed something it would never forget. Maddox had been unmade without a single strike, his power stripped by the quiet strength of a man who had refused to bow. The crowd parted as the stranger walked slowly toward his horse, the sound of his boots echoing against the silence. He paused only once, turning his gaze back to Maddox, and spoke again, his words final, unyielding. "Strength is not in tricks, Sheriff. Strength is knowing when not to fight." And with that he mounted his weary horse, waiting in the quiet as the people of Dry Creek realized that the measure of a man was not in how loud he laughed or how quick he drew, but in how steady he stood when pride and fear demanded he fall. The night closed over the town, but the lesson of that day burned brighter than the lamps in the saloon. The stranger had shown them what true strength was, and the shadow of that moment would follow every man and woman who had stood on that street for the rest of their days. The duel that never was lingered in Dry Creek like a memory too heavy for the wind to carry away. People rose the next morning and went about their routines, water drawn from the well, doors swept, cattle driven out toward the dry ridges, but nothing felt the same. The street where Sheriff Maddox had been stripped of his power without a shot fired still seemed to hum with the silence of that evening. Some said they had slept poorly, dreaming of the ragged man who had stood unshaken while the sheriff fumbled in anger. Others woke with a strange lightness, as though they had seen something they thought long dead come back to life. Hope was not a word often spoken in Dry Creek, but it stirred now, timid and unfamiliar. The stranger had not left with the night. At dawn he was seen leading his weary horse to the blacksmith's trough, speaking soft words as he brushed its coat with slow strokes. Those who passed by expected him to vanish after his display, riding into the desert like a ghost, but instead he lingered. He moved through the town with quiet purpose, asking for no favor, demanding no recognition. When an old woman struggled to lift a bucket from the well, he was there to take the rope and lower it gently. When two children fought over a stick in the street, he knelt between them, speaking with such patience that the quarrel ended in embarrassed silence. His hands were steady, his voice calm, his presence firm, but never harsh. The people who had once seen only rags now began to see a man whose dignity was greater than the sheriff's star had ever been. Inside the saloon, Maddox drank more than usual. He sat at the back table, nursing whiskey after whiskey, his deputies whispering nervously at his side. They still wore their badges, still strutted with the weight of office, but every time they passed someone on the street, eyes avoided theirs. Respect, once demanded, had turned to pity or quiet contempt. The law had not changed, but the people's hearts had. The deputies felt it in every hollow greeting, and Maddox felt it in his bones. A badge that drew no obedience was nothing but tin, and for the first time in years he wondered if the people of Dry Creek might someday stop listening altogether. The stranger gave them reason to believe. He did not seek to replace the sheriff, did not boast of his victory or even mention the street duel. Instead, he went about quietly, showing with each small act what strength truly looked like. When a farmer's wagon lost a wheel, he lifted the frame long enough for repairs. When the blacksmith's boy cut his hand on a shard of metal, the stranger bound it with cloth from his own sleeve. When drunken voices rose in the saloon, threatening to spill into a fight, he stepped through the door and stood with folded arms, saying nothing. The quarrel ended without a punch thrown, as though the men had suddenly remembered themselves under his watchful eye. Children followed him in the afternoons, trying to mimic the way he walked, slow and grounded, or the way he lifted his hands open instead of clenched. He never chased them away. Sometimes he paused, showing them how to step lightly, how to shift weight from one foot to the other, how to breathe slowly so that anger did not boil too fast. To the children it seemed like a game, but the older folks who watched knew it was something more. It was teaching. It was passing down a way of being that had been absent in Dry Creek, where authority had been nothing more than threats in the sheriff's voice. Maddox, meanwhile, withered. He shouted less and sulked more, his pride wounded deeper than any bullet could pierce. His deputies tried to stir trouble, tried to reclaim the street by mocking the stranger again, but each attempt faltered. No one laughed with them anymore. When they shoved a ranch hand, hoping to spark fear, others stepped forward instead of back. When they sneered at the preacher, his parishioners stood silent but tall, no longer cowed. And when they muttered insults at the stranger himself, he only looked at them with the same calm eyes and walked on. Their power was gone, not by law, not by violence, but by example. The townsfolk began to gather in small knots, speaking in low voices of what had happened, of what might come next. They were not planning rebellion, not yet, but they had tasted the thought that Dry Creek could be different. For years they had accepted that fear was the price of order. Now they had seen that order might be born from dignity instead. A seed once planted cannot be unplanted. Maddox could not undo the sight of his revolver lying in the dirt, of his arm guided like a child's, and the people could not unsee the calm strength of the man who had needed no badge to command respect. One evening, the stranger sat on the porch of the boarding house, repairing his horse's bridle. A small group gathered near, hesitant but curious. An older man asked, "Why did you stay? You could have ridden out, left us with the memory of that night. Why linger in a place like this?" The stranger looked up, his face as unreadable as ever. "Because leaving would change nothing. A man passes through and he's forgotten. But if I stay a while, perhaps someone here remembers not to bow their head next time mockery comes. Perhaps a child remembers to stand straight, even when others laugh. That's enough reason to stay." The words sank into the listeners like rain into dry ground. They nodded, some quietly wiping their eyes, and returned home with lighter steps. Soon after, the preacher invited the stranger to speak to the youth behind the church. The blacksmith asked if he would teach his apprentices a few tricks to steady their hands when tempers ran high. Mothers brought their sons, fathers brought their daughters, all curious to learn something they had sensed but not understood. The stranger never preached. He showed with small demonstrations how to move aside instead of meeting force head-on, how to speak low instead of shouting, how to measure the distance between oneself and another so that blows could not land too easily. The lessons were simple, but the people listened as if hearing them for the first time. By the time a week had passed, Dry Creek felt altered. Children no longer ran from Maddox when he walked the street. Farmers no longer doffed their hats out of fear, but only from habit. Even the air seemed less heavy, as though the town itself had been waiting for the moment someone would remind them of their dignity. Maddox still carried his badge, but it no longer gleamed with authority. It was the stranger who commanded attention now, not by force, not by threat, but by the quiet weight of who he was. Yet the stranger asked for nothing. When offered meals, he paid what little coin he had. When offered a bed, he thanked them but often chose the porch. He never boasted, never retold the moment on the street. He lived as though it had been nothing more than another day. And in that, the people found the clearest lesson of all. Strength did not shout. Strength did not need to remind the world of itself. True strength was quiet, steady, and unshaken. At last, when the time came for him to leave, no one wanted to see him go. The morning was cool, the desert stretching wide with a pale light, and the townsfolk gathered as he saddled his horse. Children clutched at their mothers' skirts, men doffed their hats, women whispered prayers under their breath. Sheriff Maddox watched from the saloon door, his face drawn and weary, his pride broken beyond repair. He said nothing, only turned back inside with shoulders slumped. The stranger mounted his horse, adjusted the brim of his hat, and looked down the long stretch of road leading away. He did not make a speech. He did not offer farewell. He simply nodded once to the crowd, a gesture of quiet respect, and then touched his spurs lightly. The horse moved forward, hooves striking the dirt in steady rhythm. The people of Dry Creek watched as he rode away, his figure shrinking against the horizon, swallowed by the dust of the plains. For a long time after he vanished, no one moved. It was as though they all understood that a chapter had closed, not just for the stranger, but for the town itself. Dry Creek did not become a place of saints overnight. Men still quarreled, whiskey still flowed, tempers still flared. But the change was undeniable. The memory of the ragged man who had shown them what dignity meant lingered in every corner, in every whispered story. Children mimicked his steady stance, old men spoke of him with respect, and even those who had mocked him now held their tongues. Sheriff Maddox remained in his post, but the people no longer bent beneath him. They had seen another way to stand, and once a man learns to stand straight, he does not easily stoop again. And so the legend of the stranger lived on, not carved in song or etched in stone, but carried in the quiet strength of a town that had once forgotten itself. They would say for years to come that he came with nothing but rags on his back and left with nothing but dust in his wake, yet gave them more than any lawman ever had. He had given them back their respect, their courage, and their hope. And that, they knew, was the truest kind of strength a man could leave behind. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And please, share this video with your friends and family, because some stories are too important to keep to yourself.